and welcome to another episode of the Up Your Assets podcast. I'm your host, Ray Ferraro, CFP, the founder and executive chair of Provise Management Group, an SEC registered investment advisor with offices in Clearwater and Tampa, Florida. Losing a spouse, especially one to whom you have been married a long time and raised a family with, is one of the most difficult and horrific events one can experience. Not to dismiss the husband losing his wife, but it is often even more traumatic for a widow. Here are the statistics. 3,000 women become widows daily in the United States. 91% experience brain fog, which is cognitive impairment affecting decision-making. 69% are forced to make unprepared decisions within the first 2 years of losing their husband. They experience a 40% drop in income, and 85% of the newly widowed population has never made a financial decision on their own. Recently, I happened to read an article penned by Chris Bentley on the subject of widowed men and women. Chris is a certified financial planner professional, among other financial credentials. He retired from being a full-time financial advisor in 2022 and now spends full-time as the founder and executive director of the not-for-profit Wings of Widows, whose mission is to provide personalized, grief-informed financial wellness coaching and education to help newly widowed women and men move forward with confidence, self-sufficiency, and hope. As a financial advisor for many years, Chris has helped numerous clients put their financial house in order after the loss of a loved one. He understands that widows and widowers need far more assistance after a devastating loss compared to his other clients. Chris received his Bachelor of Science degree from the United States Naval Academy and his Master of Business Administration from the University of Minnesota prior to turning his attention to financial services. Chris lives with his wife, Susie, in Minneapolis with their 3 cats. Together, they have 7 children and 6 grandchildren. Chris, welcome to Up Your Assets.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our conversation this morning.
Absolutely. So, Chris, I need to ask, 7 kids. I mean, you're in the service. You were away. How did that happen?
When I got home.
Well said.
We are a blended family, so I was actually only responsible for making 5 of them. But the 6 grandkids, I can claim all of those. We have all six of the 7 children are now married, and so 1 left to go. And so I think there are more grandchildren in our future, which of course we're looking forward to.
Well, Chris, delighted to have you here on the podcast. Help us understand how you became an expert in understanding the unique circumstances of losing a spouse.
Yeah, it wasn't in the cards. It wasn't in my plan. It was nothing that I was ever thought I would be doing, is becoming an expert in the field of widowhood. It grew naturally out of being a financial advisor. And I had a colleague pass away, and I, by sheer happenstance, inherited his widow, his wife, Leanne, and their children. And as I began working with her, this was February of 2017, and I worked with her throughout the year, and she felt, we felt like we got her in a pretty good place by year end. And she invited me to a luncheon with a number of other widows that she had met during Grief Share. She called them her Grief Share buddies. And what she learned in Grief Share was that she was way further, down the road and feeling comfortable and self-sufficient and hopeful. Of course, she was still grieving and missing her husband, Dave, but she felt like she was in a different place than her Grief Share buddies, many of whom had lost husbands many years before she lost Dave. And so she thought I could come down and help. And so I said I'd meet, and I did sit with them for a number of hours. And that was the first time I'd ever actually just listened to a lot of widows, in this case, just talk. And what I learned was that they weren't getting the help that they needed. Some of them had nowhere to turn. They didn't have a financial advisor, but others did have a financial advisor, and yet they still felt like they were still struggling. I just thought that was so strange. Like, how is that possible? There must be help out there if you don't have an advisor. And if you do, Why aren't they able to help you? Well, so I rode off on my white horse and thought I'd come back with all the answers. And what I learned was there was nothing out there for me to refer them to. I scoured the internet. I went to AARP. I thought there'd be nonprofits. And what I learned was there wasn't a single organization that provided advice and guidance around the practical matters of loss. Sure, there was Grief Share and other grief and bereavement support organizations, but not one in the United States that helped a widowed person address all those, the money, the practical matters, the legal, tax. There's nobody doing that. And 80% of US adults don't have a financial advisor. And I just thought, well, where are they supposed to go? Grief Share or the laundromat? They're getting their help from other widows, maybe siblings, maybe adult children. What do they know about widowhood? And so that was sort of the impetus for me to learn more. And over the course of nearly a decade, I guess I have become something of an expert. And I think the realization was back then in 2018 when I founded Wings for Widows was that there are a lot of folks out there that don't even know what they don't know, have never been down this path,
I
and
know.
they are struggling. And some of them are not just struggling, but we're in crisis. And I can speak to that later. But really, this is a crisis situation. It wasn't just I was working with someone that had a net worth of a couple of $1 million. You knew they were going to be okay, but what about that widow or widower that didn't have a financial plan or a financial advisor and not enough income to even start an IRA? I mean, that's crisis, when you lose a spouse. So that's sort of the beginning of the journey, and the journey has been one of just constant learning and really never looking back and trying to figure out where the gaps were and how we could help fill those gaps.
It's funny how life comes along and smacks us in the face and says, "Hey, this is what you really ought to be doing." So, congratulations for recognizing and moving forward with it. So, Chris, most people view widowhood primarily as an emotional crisis. Why do you describe it as a financial emergency? And what begins happening financially almost immediately after a spouse dies?
I think the number one question we get is from widows is, "Am I going to be okay?" And what they mean by that is, "Do I have any money?" And fear is probably the number one emotion, fear and uncertainty, or fear of the future and the uncertainty that comes with that. Because most at that time of loss, and certainly for several months thereafter, are living in some state of fear. And therefore, that's paralyzing. They can't make decisions. They don't know what they have. They don't know where to start. They don't know where to look first. They don't know how to take that first step. And rather than make a mistake, they don't take that first step. So they're just kind of frozen in their tracks. And so the number one question is, do I have any money? And so that's a financial emergency because many of them don't. That's a crisis, as I said earlier.
Hmm.
So if you in the U.S., there's a number of facts. You read off a number of statistics that are correct and paints a pretty dire picture in general. The average age of a widow in the U.S. is 59, much younger than most people would believe, which means there's a lot of young widows out there. And if you're a young widow and you're at home with the children and your spouse dies and he was the only breadwinner, that's a 100% decrease in income. The average in the U.S. is about 50%. About 50% of widows lose about 50% of their income. And if you're if you're drawing on Social Security benefits in retirement, it's about a 37% drop in income. If you and I experienced a 37 to 100% drop in our income, that would be a crisis. It would be an emergency, right?
Sure
And
would
so
be.
that's the widowhood, financial emergency. That's really it comes down to um, what do I have? Most do not know. Most believe that whatever they did have died with their spouse, which is the total, fear taking over any rational thought, because that's not how it works. You and I know that. But this idea that they Many of them are in a crisis because of that loss of income. That's the number one driver. And the second driver would be that they never talked about this emergency. They never talked about losing a spouse. And so, as you mentioned, so many are unprepared. They don't have the experience. They haven't been making those decisions at home, and suddenly they're entrusted with all the decisions. So you have this loss of income. You mentioned cognitive impairment that can last up to 2 years, and yet you need to make decisions during those 2 years when you're least prepared to do so. That's the emergency sort of wrapped around this financial crisis of loss of income. And that's really what creates, I believe, in widowhood, early widowhood, this financial emergency.
So Chris, I'd like to go back to that experience that moved you to go in this direction for a minute. You mentioned a number of things, like you went out to the internet to see what resources might be available, and there wasn't very much that was out there. What other services did you see that they needed to be aware of that you've incorporated into your wonderful website, Wings for Widows?
That's a great question. Well, there was nothing, and there still is nothing. A decade later, we're still the only game in town. It's hard to believe.
Wow.
And when I say that, I'm not saying that there aren't financial advisors that have specialized in providing, a more specific help for widowed persons. So they are. That's it's a like it's a niche, and some either due to loss in their own right or just sort of discovered the same thing I had, that there's really no one filling this gap. And with 3,000 widows a day, 1.5 million a year, that's a lot of potential clients if you look at it from that perspective. So I'm surprised there aren't a lot more financial advisors jumping into this space. But one of the things that we implemented, we thought coaching, right? We wanted to provide, as I said, at no cost, financial guidance and advice to widowed people, whether they could afford it or not. So all of our services are free. And we found was that a large group, even if you offer them professional, right, CFP coaches for free to work with you, come alongside and just work through all the things you need to work through. Many do not, right, take us up on that offer, which still boggles my mind. That's a head scratcher. The reason is largely not everybody, we're not a household name. Not everybody knows who we are, but we're pretty easy to find. Google widow finance and we pop right to the top. So not too hard. And we discovered that widows often come to us with what's known as money shame. They feel they're going to be judged for having made perhaps bad decisions, or they weren't savers, they were spenders. And so they would love the help, but they decide not to accept it because they're simply embarrassed about their financial situation. And so as a result of that, we created a WidowWise University. So it's essentially our coaching program on steroids. We have over 100 lessons, way more than our coaches usually can get to. But it's provided on a university for those do-it-yourselfers. For those that don't want to one-on-one coaching with a real live person, they can now go and take this course at their pace, 24/7. You know that most widows and widowers are up between midnight and 4 a.m. So so we make it all right. Financial advisors, your coach, are not up at midnight to 4 a.m. to work with you. So WidowWise University sort of fills that gap. So that was a gap that we saw to provide an alternative to coaching, and that could be accessible 24/7.
That's
And I think
what a
that was the
wonderful
big one,
service.
Ray.
Yeah, I was going to say, what a wonderful service. Just amazing. So let's get down to some of the practical parts, for if we can, Chris. What should someone do during the first few weeks after losing a spouse? And I guess just as importantly, what decisions should they avoid making too quickly?
Well, as I mentioned, the financial piece, that core of that is cash flow, right? What's coming in, because that's probably changed, and what's going out, and that will probably have to change. And so I think that's the most immediate area that we focus on um, with a client is really helping them understand what's the new normal, right? Because it's different.
Hmm.
And so that is job one, because uh, if we can solve that problem, it also relieves an enormous amount of stress. Losing a spouse is the most stressful event in the human experience, and so um, besides the grief, whether learning whether or not you can stay in your home is pretty important. Whether or not the kids are ever going to go to college again, and all these sorts of things, right? All these dreams of ours are on hold until we understand what's the new normal for our around our finances. Most aren't using budgets. So many of the folks we work with, as you pointed out, 86% are now feeling the shoes of the spouse who was taking care of the household finances. And
Hmm.
so it's as simple as learning where the passwords are kept, learning how to get online to even look at the bank account. There are so many necessary things to do, but number one is let's make sure that you have more coming in that you have going out. And then what do we have to do if that's not the case? Let's solve that problem first. So
Yeah.
that's number one. Number two is understanding who owns what and who owes what. And what I mean by that is uh, assets that look like they may be family assets could be the deceased spouse's automobile. There could be a creditor tied to that. The surviving spouse can't just get rid of that car. Um, so, did the deceased spouse have assets that can be matched with any liabilities? That's essentially the probate process. So we have to know who owns what. Is there a trust involved? Are there assets in the trust? Because then the trust will determine what needs to be done. Um, if there's uh, assets that are owned by the deceased, those assets and those liabilities need to stay separate from the joint assets or her or the survivor's personal assets. So really that is really important to figure out right away so that they don't get into legal trouble by selling assets that should have been retained, not paying off one creditor and then not being able to pay off another creditor. That's for the courts to decide during the probate process.
Sure.
So the first thing we recommend is making sure that we connect them if they don't already have them with an estate planning attorney to help them through some of that. They're best qualified to work through that, as well as through the will or trust assets and just all of those types of legal questions. But the things not to do is don't rush to decisions. This is a common um, recommendation to all widows, right? Don't do anything in the first 12 months. That's great advice, but it's not always practical. If
Yeah.
you're in a home and you've just lost 100% of your income, you may not be able to pay that mortgage next month, and you certainly can't wait 12 months to figure out whether you can pay that mortgage. So some folks are going to have to make major decisions about relocating, which may include selling a home, right? Relocating, going back to work. These are major decisions. So what we like to say is slow down, right? Slow down. You do not have to rush these decisions. Let's take them one at a time. If you try to solve everything in the first day, you're going to be overwhelmed and probably make some pretty bad decisions. So
Yeah.
the things not to do is to rush into any decision. Make sure you're doing your homework. Make sure you've got the professionals alongside of you, and make the decisions when it's appropriate to make those decisions.
Yeah, it obviously in the beginning it's so important for them to focus on themselves and on their family. And while people feel like, well, I gotta immediately go do this or go do that, uh, there's plenty of time in most cases for to take care of notifying the insurance companies, to taking care of Social Security if the decedent was taking that, and fixing all of that, fixing all of that. So great advice to avoid making those decisions quickly unless you absolutely have to, which is unfortunately the case, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
So
Ray,
one of
that's
the things. One of the things I wanted to ask you about in reading some of your material is that you recommend pulling all three credit reports for both spouses after someone has passed away. Why is that one of the most valuable and least understood steps a surviving spouse can take?
You talked about reaching out to organizations, and this is kind of a continuation of that idea, right? One of the other first things we do that you touched on was making sure if there's an employer that they're making contact with that HR department, make sure that they're getting those benefits, helping them through that insurance claim to make sure they can get those claims submitted and those dollars into the right, because those dollars are very important during this transitional period, which may take up to a year, right, to make these decisions. So along with reaching out to those organizations, it's important to pull the credit reports. And as you know, there's three agencies. And um, yes, pulling from three are great. We recommend at least two out of the three agencies, and that's because not all creditors report the same thing to all three agencies. So we like to have a couple of credit reports to compare, and generally, out of the two out of the three, you capture everything that you want to know. Um, and it's one of the first questions we ask is, when was the last time you pulled a credit report for yourself? And usually it's been years. And when was the last time you pulled your spouse's credit report? And almost never. And so we found that this was a great thing to do in that first meeting or two with the client, because the client, the surviving spouse, doesn't always know, especially with this. We've talked about cognitive impairment and fear and paralyzation and right. So what we're trying to do is peel back the onion. Let's understand your financial situation. Let's get some clarity on, we kind of know about your income, but maybe we don't know everything we should know about your expenses. So let's peel back that onion and dive a little deeper. And there is no better place to get an inventory, particularly when they don't know, of what you owe than pulling a credit report, because everything you owe is on the credit report. So folks kind of overlook that fact, and they're free and it's
Yeah.
easy to do. So why not do it? Why not pull a credit report for yourself and pull a couple of credit reports for your spouse, which you can do, and then compare. And what we find are the surviving spouses finding accounts open that they had no idea were open. I didn't
Oops.
know he had an account at Home Depot with a $3,000 balance. That explains all the equipment in the tool shed, right? I
Uh,
mean, they just don't know, but there it is in black and white. And so that's sort of job one. What's there, right? What's a surprise? Are there any surprises? And by the time we pull that, usually the status has changed to deceased. If there are creditors where the status is still active, not deceased, then those are creditors that need to be called,
mhm.
and that needs to be updated. And in general, we recommend, if there are balances, to call all the creditors, right? And explain what's happened. Say, my husband just passed away, or my wife just passed away. I'm working through this. It looks like we're going to be in probate for a while, so get in line. But, I haven't forgotten about you, but not going to be paying their credit card. I'm not going to be paying you until I have my attorney go through all of this. And that usually keeps them at bay, and they won't send you off to collections. So you avoid that hassle by just having a simple conversation with them. So we recommend have a notebook close by one, work through the phone numbers are right there. Call every one of those creditors. You may not want to do it all at once, it's a lot, but call those creditors, keep notes, circle the action items. Many creditors will close the account right there on the spot. Sometimes you'll have to send in a death certificate. Client will have to send in a death certificate, particularly if there's a balance. And then with that death certificate, oftentimes if it's a small balance, they'll just remove it. They'll just close the account,
Yep.
which is great. So that's why we think it's so important to do this, because there's a lot of good things. There's no bad things. There's a lot of good things that can come from it. So we recommend doing that right away.
Right. So, what are some of the financial rights, let's say benefits and deadlines widowed people commonly miss? And how do they avoid missing them just because nobody tells them that they actually exist in the first place?
The most common one, the clock's ticking on a number of items, to your point. There are deadlines, and nobody comes and, wakes you up in the middle of the night and says, you got a deadline tomorrow morning. I mean, you have to self-advocate a lot as a widowed person. That's what Wings for Widows tries to do alongside is to point out these issues. And they don't all happen at once, but they all happen quietly. For example, the first one that we almost missed, and that's when I retired from Ameriprise, and we got that Cobra letter, right? The offer to continue my health care insurance to my wife and I. And it's a it was a third party. It's not an envelope I recognize. I almost threw it out. More junk mail, right? Because most of what we get today is junk mail. And I wasn't keeping track of the 60 days, but there it was. And I almost missed it. And I'm trained to not miss it.
Wow.
And so, you get 60 days to accept the offer to extend into the Cobra, which is essentially higher cost, but it doesn't require an exam, and you can continue the same healthcare coverage that you had while your spouse was working. So if your spouse is deceased, that offer is still going to come, and you have 60 days to accept or decline it. That one gets missed a lot. The other big one that happens at the 2-year mark, and there's a few in between, but the other big one is around your home, and even professionals just miss this one because nobody puts it on the calendar. But the idea here is that when you sell your home, there's the qualifying surviving spouse. If she sells the principal residence, there's some caveats to that. But if she sells or he sells within 2 years of the death, they're eligible for the full exclusion amount for a married couple, which is $500,000 of gain. So if you bought a house, 20 years ago and it's appreciated nicely and you've got $500,000 of gain, you're not going to pay any capital gains on that if you sell your home within 2 years. If you sell your home 2 years and a day, that exclusion gets reduced to $250,000, half, which means that if you had $500,000 of gain, you are now going to be paying capital gains on $250,000, whereas one day earlier, you didn't have to pay a thing. So nobody puts that date on the calendar 2 years out. And frankly, that's when, if you think about it, this cognitive impairment and we're making decisions and people say, well, don't make any decisions that first year. And we stay in our house that first year. Somebody ought to be advising in that second year about that deadline coming up. Because if you're going to move, think about it now. And it isn't so much that you have to move. Just know that there's a deadline out there so that if you are thinking about moving, you do it before you pass that deadline. Well, those are a couple of examples of some of those rights and benefits that are often missed.
A big one to miss for sure. So you talked about the husband having that account at Home Depot. Tell us, that question comes up. Well, do I have to pay my spouse's debts? And what should people understand before paying a deceased spouse's credit cards, medical bills, and other obligations?
It's a great question, Ray, because it comes up all the time. There's almost always debt, and it comes down to the kind of debt, right? So does the spouse owe the deceased spouse's debts? Not automatically and not generally, right? A deceased person's debts are generally obligations of their estate, right? And rather than the surviving spouse personally, but they don't know that. There's a story I like to tell of a woman that we worked with. We got to her about 3 months after the loss, but prior to her reaching out to us and us working with her, her husband had a long illness, eventually died. And during that illness, she kept asking him, he was a consultant, business for himself. And she kept asking, right, John, this is all right. This is all settled, right? You've taken care of all of this. Yes. Yes, I have. Yes, I have, repeatedly. And then he passes away. And about a month later, she gets a letter from the post office saying, better come down to the post office. Got a whole bin of stuff here for you. And she's like, what's going on? She goes down there and he had not closed his business. And the bin was full of demand letters and overdrafts and just horrible. And well, once she got over the shock and the anger and started sorting through all of these bills, about this time she had received her $50,000 term life insurance. And you can see what happened. With all
Yeah.
these demand letters, she felt she was responsible for covering all of her husband's debts. And so she used the only money that she had coming in, right, as a benefit, and used it all to pay off all of his obligations. Now, ethically, it was a kind thing to do, but legally, it was not required. She shouldn't have paid any of those. And I didn't. It was really tough when we met with her, and she had said that she felt so proud because she had finished paying off all of his debts, and I just shook my head. So
That's
that's one of those things that so generally no, if they are an obligation of the deceased spouse or the spouse's business, they are not the survivor's obligation. Um, if you're again, I mentioned kind of how the debt was owned. If there's a co-signer or joint account holder, may be responsible, but an authorized user, like on a credit card, generally is not responsible, right? So there's a difference. If you may be an authorized user,
yeah.
but it doesn't mean that you're an owner of that debt. And people they stumble on that fact. And then it's different in community property states. I think there's still nine of those, and so there's some rules that change slightly on that. Um, Best to work with a professional based on property ownership. It's different in those nine states. And I think the other big question that comes up are around medical bills because oftentimes the medical bills accrue while you're in a long-term situation, right? Caregiving situation. You're doing everything you can to save your spouse's life. And so you're spending money. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It could be your retirement savings. It could be credit cards. It could be a HELOC. I've seen some horrible cases with prolonged illness where they've literally drained every account they had. Went from middle income earners to nearly bankrupt at the time of death, and then strapped with $250,000 in bills. What do you do? And most hope that those are the responsibility of the deceased, but they're not.
Yeah.
It's very rare that it is, unless the deceased put it on one of their credit cards or owned the home outright and took out a HELOC to cover their medical bills. And things like that can work. There are alternatives, but generally that forethought isn't the case. So um, what I say is advocate for yourself, uh, or befriend somebody or use someone to advocate for you when it comes to medical bills. And many, many, many times I have advocated for clients, intervened directly or indirectly, and have had medical bills reduced significantly. We had one client when I was first coaching back in 2020 owed $250,000 to the Mayo Clinic, and we got that down to $27,000 in a payment plan, and she was able to break out of that stranglehold and move on with her life. And in fact, Joe is a board member at Wings for Widows today because of that experience with us. So yeah, that could be where a lot of the debt lays is, and don't just pay it. Try to negotiate that down.
Well, Chris, a lot of couples already have a financial advisor, attorney, an accountant, maybe an insurance professional. After the death of a spouse, why do they still fall through the cracks? And how can someone tell whether a professional truly understands widowhood?
That's a great question because I think I was a pretty darn good financial advisor, and I didn't understand widowhood. My mother was a widow, and I didn't my sisters and I had to go take care and clean up her mess, right? My dad and her, and then when she died, her stuff. And that was 10 years before I became an advisor. And even after I became an advisor, I did the best I could, but I really didn't understand widowhood. So I think that people fall through the crack not out of neglect or intent, but just out of not understanding, not working with enough widow clients like we have to really kind of break through and understand what they need. And I think it's inherent in a financial advisor. We just talk about financial advisors, and I know them, that group, right, better than I know estate planning attorneys or CPAs. But, we get things done. We have a lot of clients and we have an agenda, and that's how we operate, 99 times out of 100. And that works really well. We're prepared. We get a lot done. We come to conclusions at the end of a meeting. We know exactly what our marching orders are, and the client feels good, and they were part of that decision making, and everybody marches smartly on. That's not how it works for a widowed client.
Hmm.
And that's the problem. And, so many things because of the cognitive impairment, because of this idea, this notion of slowing down. It isn't about you know, getting a lot done. It's about helping the client regain confidence and let the client be part of those decisions to get things done. And that's just a disconnect in our profession.
Yeah.
Everything feels urgent. We want to get things done. We want to make sure our clients know that we're working for them. And it's just not that. It just doesn't work that way. Everything has to be slower. Communications have to be slower. Much less can be accomplished in a month, let alone in a meeting.
Right.
And so I think that's the big disconnect. Not that they fall through the cracks, but I think ultimately what I have seen is maybe a year or two down the road when the fog clears and sort of they're back, their faculties are back, their decision making prowess has returned. And they look back over the last 2 years and they wonder, how did all these things change in my account? Why are all these things different? I don't know. To help me understand, why am I invested here, or why do I have this annuity? And it's because they weren't part of that decision. They were just nodding yes when the advisor was telling them what they should do, and they really weren't part of that decision. And it just gets done. And that's a huge mistake. That's a huge mistake.
Indeed, it is. So let's look. We've been talking about what to do afterwards. What can married couples and families do now to make the financial transition less chaotic if one of the spouses dies unexpectedly? Help us think about that front end.
Yeah, the answer is so obvious. Talk. Talk about it. Um, Unfortunately, that's probably the hardest thing for Americans in a Western culture to do, is to talk about end of life and to prepare for it.
Sadly, that's the case.
That's it. We don't talk about it. We always have tomorrow to talk about those hard things. Why should we talk about that today? Let's go on a picnic. Let's go play with the kids. We'll worry about that another day. And so we just kick that can down the road until one of us passes, and then and again, that's why Wings for Widows exists. If folks did proper end of life planning, there wouldn't be a need for Wings for Widows. I mean, there might be, but generally, what we see is so messed up. In fact, I was so incensed about what I was seeing that in 2020, I launched my first book, The Legacy Planning and Conversation Guide, and it specifically says conversation guide because nobody was talking. I realized that these folks were coming to us, and that what I was hearing made no sense whatsoever. Why were loans? He's on his deathbed, and you take out a loan to redo the master bathroom at $30,000 when you don't have a nickel in your retirement savings or your emergency fund. You saddle her with a loan as you're going, leaving this green earth. What were you thinking? So, I mean, that's just one example of just the stuff you see, but mostly it's just not planning. Insurance would cure so many ills. That's why I'm a big fan of life insurance. It would just cure so many ills for children, for college, for staying in the home. That transitional period would not be a concern. Bills would be paid. Very little gets changed in the financial makeup of a family, of a household with life insurance, but 70% of U.S. adults are either underinsured or not insured. And so, we that's a problem right from the get-go. we see them and there's no reserve savings, there's no reserve rainy day fund, there's no life insurance. And so it's a crisis, just as we said. So talk about it, have those conversations, make sure that both of you are attending. If you have financial advisors and CPAs, that your both spouses are attending those meetings. It's so important that both spouses understand. They may not understand, modern portfolio theory, but they should understand what they have and why,
Mhm.
right? Oh, I know that this account is doing this and that's qualified. That means that I can't touch it without a penalty and I'm saving money there for my retirement. You should at least know that much, right? I think you'd agree. And so, that making sure the appropriate estate documents are up to date. You can't believe how many folks in blended families still have the ex-wife on the deed to the home.
See it all the time. I get it.
It's like, please, please get these things fixed. And so, there's, creating a digital access plan. I think we hear just as often. Yeah, I don't know where my husband's passwords or I don't know how to get online. I don't know where our accounts are. I mean, it's like forensic financial, right? Uh, uh, Help that we're providing. We have to help them go find all of this. And it's like all you had to do was talk about it and leave it in a file for them, right? So those are the kinds of very simple things that folks ought to be talking about now, not when they think they still have time, because none of us know what's in store for us tomorrow.
Well, Chris, interesting you say that, and you don't know this, but at the Up Your Assets website, there is a button that leads you to what we call the Estate Navigator, and it does just what you just talked about. There's a lot of paper and pencil kind of way to organize an estate, but there's very little that is digital on the computer. We've actually developed one. So people who happen to be listening to this, if they agree they ought to be proactive, which I hope they are, this is a great tool to help you organize your estate. And while it certainly doesn't solve anything on the emotional side, it maybe it cuts down a little bit on the emotional side by helping on the financial side if someone's taken the time to fill it all out. And speaking of something that you've done, I'd like to ask you to talk just a little bit, because we're just about out of time, but tell us a little bit about the film you've produced and that's at your website. I found it fascinating.
Well, thank you. I appreciate hearing that. And I'm going to check out your website. I love the idea of what you've created. And yeah, everyone who's listening should go there today and check that out. I think that's fantastic.
I didn't pay Chris to say that, honestly.
No, but there's just not enough of those what am I trying to say? Enough of those out there, these types of tools out there, and they should be utilized because their research does show that by doing this work ahead of time, it does cut down on the stress after the loss. There's the emotional stress and distress, but if you've solved some of these problems ahead of time, then obviously you've reduced that other side of the coin, that financial stress, the practical stress of not knowing what's going on. You've already talked about it, and that's just wonderful to know that you offer that tool, Ray. The film, we wanted to do a corporate film, if you will, but we didn't want to do it too soon. We wanted to make sure that we knew what the message was that we wanted to send out there, and so we wanted to be less about us, Wings for Widows, and more about the folks who use our services and who volunteer to guide these widows to self-sufficiency and hope and confidence and all those things that we look for in our outcomes. And so we took 7 widows, 6 clients, and 4 coaches, and we spent 3 days filming in a studio here near our office, and it was a great experience. And we flew these clients in from around the country, flew the coaches in. Who we had a couple of folks here local, but most everybody flew in, gave us a chance. In some cases, that was the first time a coach and client had met in person. Everything had been virtual. it was a bit of a homecoming to have coaches and clients together and lots of food and spend all day together before they jumped back on an airplane or we went to dinner. But the 6-minute video is essentially a story of these 6 clients and how these volunteer coaches helped them through their worst experience in their life. And so it's a short story about each of the clients and how they lost their spouse. And we try to personalize it, with photos of their spouse and having the widow tell their story. And then how Wings for Widows, essentially threw them the life ring was a service that brought them sort of out of the mire, out of the muck, and into the light. And it came from the heart. It was just a wonderful opportunity to not talk about numbers and talk about all of our services, but just have the clients and the coaches tell the story for us. And I think it came out pretty good. So I appreciate the kind words.
I was very impressed. So as we wrap up, if folks have stayed with us through the podcast and they want to learn more, where do we tell them to go?
That's easy. wingsforwidows.org. You can Google us and come visit our website. It is chock full of services and tools. Just about almost everything is free, and if there's a charge on anything, we offer scholarships so that everyone can have access. And I'm only talking about the university. We have some courses on there that aren't free. There's so much that is free. But on the courses, to help keep the lights on over at the university, we charge a nominal fee, but anyone can apply for a scholarship. We award it, and you can have access for 12 months at no cost whatsoever. So, wingsforwidows.org.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate this. I've just been fascinated with what you were doing and how you've specialized, filled this void with Wings for Widows. And the beauty of it is, if you have a lot of money, it's very helpful. If you have very little money, it's even more helpful because, as you say, most of your resources are free of charge. So, Chris, I want to thank you once again for being with us on the Up Your Assets podcast.
Thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure having this time with you and talking about this, and sure appreciate the invite. And thank you so much.
You bet. And now go out there and up your assets.
This has been another edition of the Up Your Assets podcast hosted by Ray Ferrara, CFP founder and executive chair of Provise Management Group, LLC. The preceding presentation was for general information purposes only and not personalized advice. Seek out a professional before making any financial decisions. Additionally, no guests pay to be on the show or are paid to be on the show. The opinions expressed are their own and not the host's or the show.